Welcome to Making Peace Visible, the podcast about peace and conflict in the media. I'm your host, Jamil Simon. Think about a conflict in your life. Does it keep you up at night? If you thought the other side did something good, would you have trouble admitting it? Does it feel like the other side is so brainwashed that it's impossible to reason with them? If you answered yes to these questions, that's a sign you might be in what investigative journalist Amanda Ripley calls high conflict, a seemingly intractable dispute that's driven more by emotion than reason. And if those questions remind you of the political divide in the United States over the past several years, you're certainly not alone. That's why I invited Amanda Ripley to be our guest this episode. Amanda's latest book is High Conflict: Why We Get Stuck and How We Get Out. As the title suggests, she followed people who made it out of high conflict and into what she calls good conflict, a place where progress actually gets made. And she has some really interesting ideas about how journalists can change the way they cover conflict in service of the public good. We originally recorded this interview in June 2022. For listeners who might not be familiar with your work, can you tell us a little bit about your background as a journalist, what kinds of things you were doing before you wrote the book?
Sure. Yes. So I have covered many things. I worked for 10 years at Time Magazine covering disasters and terrorism. And then I covered education for The Atlantic and wrote a book about that. And so I thought I was pretty comfortable with conflict. I thought I understood it pretty well. And then about 6 years ago, it started to feel like there was a lot I didn't understand. It felt like journalism wasn't functioning the way it was supposed to function. And the political conflict in the US was no longer behaving in a linear fashion. You know, it just didn't make sense to me. Yeah. So I sort of went back to school, so to speak, and started really immersing myself with conflict mediators, negotiators, psychologists, people who understand conflict differently than journalists, and realized there was a lot that I did not know.
In your presentation for the Alliance for Peacebuilding last year that I had the pleasure of seeing, Liz Hume mentioned that you saw early on, and as you were just talking about in a sense, what signs of what was to come. You recognized the dangers of toxic polarization. So what were the red flags that you saw, and what about them concerned you?
Well, they were not subtle. There were things like, half the country didn't believe that the places I was writing for were telling the truth. And no amount of investigative reporting or Freedom of Information Act requests or documenting of leaks and lies, none of that was really changing people's opinions. And it became clear that emotion mattered a lot more than facts. But most journalists were still, sort of engaging in the magical thinking that, like, if we can just lay out the facts and make them look pretty, then people will believe us again.
And it just
so those are
worked.
all sort of signs. Yeah, right. Those are all sort of signs that the conflict is no longer operating in a healthy function, and it's sort of something that you have to change how you engage with it, as you know. I mean, any intuitive thing you do in high conflict usually makes things worse. So you really, your only choice is to do counterintuitive things as an individual, as a politician, as a journalist, whether it's high conflict divorce or high conflict politics. That is the big lesson that I learned from people who have shifted out of high conflict into good conflict or healthy conflict, is that you really have to step out of the dance. You can't do what your first instinct tells you to do, unless you really want to be in high conflict. And in that case, that's understandable and human, but it does tend to mean that you will eventually harm the thing that you hold most dear, right? That you will do harm to the thing you went into the conflict to protect.
Explain that a little more clearly. I'm not sure I got that.
Well, okay. So for me, it was just really helpful to sort of notice the difference between high conflict and good conflict, right? So high conflict being the kind of conflict sometimes called intractable conflict, right? Or malignant conflict. High conflict is the kind of conflict that takes on a life of its own, and the facts no longer really matter. It becomes an us versus them sort of binary conflict, and the conflict itself is the destination. There's no movement. There's a feeling of being stuck, and you're just sort of repeating yourself over and over in an endless, miserable loop. It's the same emotions over and over. There's much higher chance of contempt and violence. Whereas good conflict or healthy conflict, right? You see more of a range of emotion, and you see more questions get asked. There's more sense of movement. In high conflict, your instinct as, say, a leader who has to make an unpopular decision might be to never let them see you sweat, right? Like, be convicted, be certain, don't reveal any vulnerability. But in fact, what you see again and again and again is that makes you a target of convenience. That you're dehumanizing yourself. You're acting like a robot, right? And it makes it easier for people to blame you. And so the cycle kind of perpetuates. Whereas, one of the things that I've learned from politicians and superintendents and CEOs who have tried to step out of the dance of high conflict is that if they reveal just 10% of their own real vulnerability, if they say publicly that they don't know what the right answer is, that they are not sleeping well at night, that they know there are no good answers, that they're going to do this knowing that, and here's why they're going to do it, that it tends to go much better. But that requires a lot of practice and preparation and courage, right? Because that
Absolutely.
is not your first instinct.
Do human beings have, or is there a way to acquire how to distinguish between conflict that is normal and healthy and sometimes very useful and high conflict?
So I ended up following, half a dozen people and communities who shifted out of high conflict into good conflict. And what they taught me was that the first step, as you know, is always learning to recognize the high conflict in your own head, right? So noticing when, say, you are lumping large groups of people together into one homogeneous category in your head, noticing when you delight in the suffering of that other group, even if it does nothing to benefit you, right?
Right.
I have sort of an appendix in the book in High Conflict that sort of details the different questions you can ask yourself to figure out if this is a high conflict. Or if you still have some room to maneuver. Sometimes in some ways, you're sort of headed in that direction, but you still have some time. Because the truth is that once you're in high conflict, it's hard to get out. It's not impossible, but it is hard. The wisest course is always to sort of avoid the tripwires that lead to high conflict and notice when you're trending in that direction. So the 4 tripwires that I talk about in the book are humiliation, conflict entrepreneurs, binary group identities, sort of false binaries, us versus them,
right,
and corruption, right? And so when all those 4 are present, you're very likely to fall into high conflict, and it's just a miserable place to live, and also an ineffective strategy for fighting for whatever it is you hold dear.
Some people might disagree about ineffective because, the right and the QAnon and all the rest, they are being effective in a very negative sort of way.
Yeah, I guess it depends on what the goal is, right?
Yeah, exactly.
If the goal is lasting, sustainable change, I'm not sure they're being effective, right?
They're not.
Because
No.
we have to live with each other in this country,
Exactly.
right? So, but you're right, in the short term, and this is why it's so magnetic, right? High conflict. It's very hard to resist the pull. Yeah, in the short term, it is effective. Let me give you an example. One of the people I followed for the book is a conflict mediator named Gary Friedman, who, has helped thousands of people through really tough labor conflicts, divorces, He and his colleagues went in when the San Francisco Symphony went on strike, canceling 43 concerts. They went in and helped everyone involved understand the deeper interests, values, identities, and come to an agreement that lasted much longer than any had lasted in recent memory. And, he taught negotiation at Harvard and Stanford. So it made sense when a few years ago, some of his neighbors in his tiny town in Northern California asked him if he would consider running for office. Because even in their little town, toxic polarization had trickled down to the meetings, which were becoming really hostile and unproductive. Things weren't getting done that needed to get done. So he agreed to do it, made a lot of sense. And as he puts it, it took him about an eighth of a second before he got sucked into high conflict himself, losing 2 years of his peace of mind to what looked like pretty small-time conflicts to an outsider. But, there's two parts to the story. The first reason I tell the story is because it shows how we are all susceptible to high conflict, to the magnetism of it, right? Especially in institutions that are currently designed to incite it, like politics, like social media, like journalism, right?
Right.
But then the second part, the hopeful part is, he figured it out. He figured out that he had lost his way and he was doing all the things that he had helped his clients not do. And so he spent the next 2 years painstakingly excavating himself out of high conflict and building good conflict in his town, in his political position. But he was much more effective. In those last 2 years, when he was in good conflict, things got fixed. Road work got done. Water rates got raised. Things that had to happen for this town to function happened, and he slept better at night. So there were different things he did, and we can talk about that if you want, but one of the things he had to do to begin with was to recognize how he had fallen into this trap.
Let's talk more about journalists and journalism. What are the most important things you think journalists can learn from your book? What is a good takeaway for the practice of journalism?
Yeah, well, I ended up hearing from a lot of journalists who really wanted to turn these ideas into practical tools for their work because, anyone covering conflict, it just gets really exhausting and also boring, frankly, after a while to keep covering it the same way. And it's very, obviously at some point you're going to lose a bunch of your readers because it's so depressing or alienating or off-putting. And so I ended up with a TV and radio journalist colleague of mine named Helene Bianduti Hofer creating a curriculum for journalists called Good Conflict Journalism. And there's a bunch of things in there, but basically the first step we do with newsrooms is we work through mapping the conflict, which mediators are familiar with, but journalists are usually not. And it's just a way to get a little bit of distance from the conflict, as William Ury says, going to the balcony, right? Like getting a little space from the conflict.
Exactly.
And creating a map, who are all the players? What are the players we don't think about, but are influencing the conflict, like the conflict entrepreneurs? And are there conflict interrupters who are influencing the conflict positively? And what are the emotions? And where is our newsroom on this map, right? They tend to enjoy that because it's like a different way of thinking about it. And then we look at what on this map is not being covered well. And then, could you show the map to people in the conflict in your community and ask them, what are we missing? And try to surface some of the deeper stories and dynamics that would help us move somewhere in the conflict, get out of that stuck feeling, and also understand the problem ourselves or the other side a little better, which I think is our main goal, right? In conflict journalism is trying to say, what is going on here? And how do we revive curiosity in a time of really entrenched false simplicity?
I think one of the things you talked about for journalists was needing more complicated, rigorous reporting. Talk about that. Rigorous in what sense? I mean, what do you think reporters need to look for that's different from what they're seeing now?
Well, typically it's getting to the understory. What is this conflict really about for different people?
Very
Not the thing we
important.
keep fighting about, right? But like, what is it really, really about? I was just reading a book called Curiosity by Ian Leslie, I believe. And he was talking about how General McChrystal, Stanley McChrystal, was saying that when the U.S. first invaded Iraq, for the first couple of years, the questions they were asking themselves, who is the enemy? Where is the enemy? Then what is the enemy doing? And he said, we only really started making progress when we started asking, why are they the enemy? Right? So it's asking different questions that get beyond the who, what, and where, and help us understand why. Why is my neighbor seeing the world so differently than I am? Often on the left, that conversation ends because people think they know. They think that Republicans in the US are just racist. I know what's in their heart. They're racist. Go do the reporting is what I'm saying. Why are they racist? Why are they trusting this news source and not the other? Where did that start? And what is the fear underneath all of that? Usually it's a fear of not belonging. Usually it's, again, humiliation, rightly or wrongly, right? But until you can illuminate that understory, you're just going to keep having the same tedious fights over and over about different things. It's going to just shape shift, right? It's going to move from masks to vaccines to baby formula to Johnny Depp. I mean, it's just boring. It just goes on and on. It's just going to never actually move anywhere interesting. So trying to investigate the understory is sort of the second step that we teach journalists after mapping the conflict is, how can we listen more deeply in interviews so we can notice little hints of the understory and then dig deeper with different questions to get to.
Also talking to different people. I mean,
talking to different people. Absolutely.
When there's a conflict, we shouldn't focus entirely on the generals, so to speak. We need to talk to the players, the people on the ground, people with different perspectives on what's happening.
Yeah. There's just a whole different kind of archetype of sources, right?
Right.
Typically, traditional journalism, right? Who do you call? You call the archetypes are like the activists, the victims,
right?
The villains, right? There's a certain
actually, a lot of people ignore the victims.
Ignore the victims, right? Yeah, right.
Or make a lot of assumptions about victims.
About who they are and what.
Right? Yeah, exactly.
The thing is, when I used to cover terrorism, we always called the victims, we always called their families, but we didn't always ask them the right questions. So even when we do call the victims, it's like, can we do something other than just spotlight your pain and suffering? In other words, do they have to play the role of victim every single time? Or could they play the role of veteran? Somebody who understands this now and understands what the rest of us do not. What do they wish had happened differently? What do they wish they had known before? What do they want the rest of us to know? What are we all getting wrong about this conflict? So it's sort of like treating them like experts as opposed to just victims.
Exactly. Because they are.
They are, absolutely. And it's very disempowering, right? If you just keep them in the victim category forever. Although there's obviously, there's an important role for spotlighting grief and suffering.
Of course. Loss. Yep. Yeah. No question about that. But yeah, it still doesn't tell the whole story. Amanda, I've heard you speak admiringly about countries where there are news outlets that are trusted across political divides. What are some of those countries where there's a higher level of trust in media across the board? And what can we learn from them?
Well, it's interesting. You have some countries, trust has actually increased over the years. And some countries, things got so bad that a lot of news outlets had to literally reinvent their whole understanding of what their job is, right? So sometimes I find it really helpful to talk to journalists in, Sierra Leone or places that have seen a lot of violent conflict very recently, because they see it as part of their job to prevent the escalation of violence, because that is how democracies end, right?
Right.
Is often through the escalation of violence. So journalists here don't typically see that as part of their job. They don't even think about it that way. So it's not just, that it's taboo. It's like not even on the radar. So
Right.
thinking about, I was talking to a journalist who does a lot of work in Sierra Leone, and he was saying how we know all around the world that typically political violence goes up right before and right after an election. So they do a lot of work preparing for that, and they do a lot of cooperating and collaborating with competitors around the country, so that even though they're normally competitors, it's so important to be able to investigate rumors.
That's so
they
critical.
have to work together, right? So this value of preventing the escalation of violence supersedes the value of getting something before your competitor. So they'll work together because they can't be in every polling place on their own at the same time. And this way they can kind of squash rumors that will lead to violence, if they're not true, more quickly.
Absolutely. They did that in Kenya after there was a lot of electoral violence. They created a program, and I can't remember what, but it uses basically cell phones and active monitors in various places to quash rumors and to share information that was important, but especially to quash rumors, because that's one of the most divisive kinds of things. There's one phrase that, is in the glossary, as a matter of fact. I love that little glossary you put together. Kind of helped to clarify some of the things. But you talked about the phrase saturation point. And, from what I know of the Colombian situation, our last episode was focused on the Colombian peace agreement. We also showed a film
I heard it.
about
I enjoyed it. I love that film.
Oh, great. Yeah, that was a wonderful film. And that's one of the things that a few people in the film talked about, is that people had just plain had enough. I mean, I don't think the United States has kind of reached that point yet, a saturation point. Some people certainly have, but not enough, I think, to change the way things are here.
Well, it's an interesting question. Usually those saturation points come with like a shock of some kind, right? Where maybe in Colombia, where they saw a lot of defections from the FARC was after a big military victory, right? Over the FARC. So that's putting pressure on the FARC. Or when there was a change in the currency valuation so that they weren't making as much money from the sale of narcotics. So life just got harder to be a guerrilla member in the FARC. So that's in some ways a saturation point, right? Where the suffering, the daily toll of the conflict starts to feel like it's no longer worth the benefits. But then other times, I spent a lot of time for the book with Curtis Toller, a former gang leader in Chicago who works with young men and women now to prevent gang violence. And they look for any shock, even if it feels small. So it could be a snowstorm where nobody gets killed for 5 days in a row. And that can create an opening where there wasn't any space before. But that pause in the conflict, or if, let's say, somebody gets shot and no one visits him in the hospital, that's when they come and visit, right? So it's important to have relationships before then, but that's an opening. So for the US, there have been moments, there have been shocks that could have been used as saturation points, but you have to prepare for those in advance, right? So January 6th, the riot in the Capitol in the United States could have been an opportunity for sure, because you had every member of Congress frightened for their lives. That is a moment where you start to really ask yourself, is this conflict worth it? Do I want to change how I'm fighting for the sake of myself and my family, if no one else?
Right.
But you have to be ready with that, with, let's say, a very simple non-aggression pact, with relationships across the aisle, with all of the kind of basic infrastructure you need to make that shift before it happens, right? Because that window closes. So I definitely think certainly most Americans have reached their saturation point. Most Americans are absolutely fed up and exhausted by the conflict. But, you need to give them another option. I don't see why we couldn't ask members of Congress to agree to come up with like 3 rules of engagement, whether it's condemning violence or not, vowing not to disrespect each other on social media. Now they're going to violate it, right? Every peace, as you know, every peace treaty gets violated. But if you have a mechanism in place to deal with that violation, you can slow down the reaction, right? So we ask young men in Chicago to do this all the time. Because most of the gang violence today starts on social media. So Curtis and his colleagues at Chicago Cred, this is all they do is ask rival gang members to agree to some basic rules of engagement because all of them want out. They all want to live a different way. And I don't know why we haven't asked members of Congress to do the same thing.
But, the work that Duke University is doing in Columbia, for example, tracking the agreement and tracking how it unfolds and who it helps and who it's not helping and where various people are deviating. And that's a really valuable, it's rare that happens, but I think the Norwegians were willing to pay for it. I mean, because they really, Santos really came up with a terrific agreement that had a lot of good economic development attached to it. So it was important to watch to see how much of it stuck, but not, unfortunately.
Right, and a lot of it did not.
A lot of it did not, unfortunately. It's really too bad.
But I agree with you that it's so important. One of the reasons I went to Columbia for the book is because, unlike most places, they really have done a pretty careful job of tracking the process and also all the disarmament process, like along the way and reintegration. And, it's really the only country I could find that had good data on who has left the conflict voluntarily and what happened to them. That's like that's the holy grail, right? Like, how do you have to learn what pulls people out and how do you help them stay out? And so I think Columbia knows more about what works and what doesn't work, because they did a lot that didn't work, than any other country.
Well, that's, I think, something that needs to be done, needs to be understood, is that sustaining a peace effort is almost as difficult as bringing the parties to some sort of constructive, successful resolution. Sustaining it is also very, very difficult because it does break down. Boy, we could talk for a long time. This is so interesting. Are there any things that I didn't ask that you think are important to say in this context?
Well, I do think, circling back to something that you mentioned earlier, that it's important to talk to different sources. This is something I've noticed starting to happen sort of organically, a little more than it has been happening, which is good and encouraging. But, the changed source is an incredibly interesting story in high conflict, like somebody who has shifted, right? So the former QAnon members, or the people who used to think one thing and now think another thing, the uncle who lost his mind watching Fox News 8 hours a day and now doesn't watch it anymore, and his family talks about how he's come back to life, right?
Right.
And so those stories, because we get a fixed mindset, right, in high conflict, where we start to believe that the other side will never change, we will never change, and the problem will never change. And that sense of fatalism and cynicism and despair is as dangerous, right,
Absolutely.
as anything else. So we see this with climate change, right? The sort of doom reporting that has typically been done on climate change over and over again, just relentlessly. And then the stories that suggest some hope, some agency, some solutions just don't get the same amount of play, right?
No, they don't.
Lately, I've seen a couple stories, like the Washington Post had 2 stories on the front page this week that were changed source stories. So one was about climate activists who used to be stridently against nuclear power who are now in favor and are talking very openly about how they made that shift because it's in the interest of the climate. And then also, there's a long, thoughtful story, right? And then also there was a story about a man in Texas who just reached a tipping point. He's a NRA member, Republican, but with the latest school shooting, he decided to drive to the police station and turn in his AR-15 because he just felt like this is a weapon of war. Now, does that change anything for, the victims of these attacks? No, it does not. But what it does is it shows us how we are all in motion, right? Like we are all trying to figure these things out. It's a very difficult time to figure out what is the right thing to do for a variety of reasons. But shining a light on people going through that journey, struggling to figure out what they should do and make sense of the world, that is something journalists can do better than anyone.
I think people should definitely read your book, High Conflict, Why We Get Trapped and How We Get Out. It's a great book filled with lots of interesting ideas and insights. Thank you so much. Thank
you, Jamil. I'm grateful for the podcast and what you're doing, and glad for the chance to talk about these stories.
We have links in the show notes to Amanda's book and to a presentation she gave on high conflict at the Alliance for Peacebuilding. You can find her reporting at amandaripley.com and follow her column in the Washington Post. Since we recorded this interview back in 2022, Amanda Ripley launched a project called Good Conflict. Good Conflict offers training and support to help journalists and others develop constructive conflict skills. Learn more at goodconflict.com. You can hear Amanda on a new podcast from the Washington Post called Impromptu. The first episode is out March 20th. Making Peace Visible is produced by Andrew Maraskin. Faith McClure is the creative director of the War Stories, Peace Stories project, and I'm your host, Jamil Simon. We'll be back with a brand new episode on March 26th. Thanks so much for listening, and talk soon.